time, I wasn't even converted at that point. And when I was converted at the age of 15, my views began to change, especially when I went to college. I went up to college at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. And while I was there, my second week there, I visited a Reformed Baptist church. And that was the first time that I actually heard expository preaching that really was aimed at the heart. One of the first times that I had really seen a church where there was a deep love and fellowship between the members of the church. And it was actually at that church that I was first introduced to the preaching and writings of both Martyn Lloyd-Jones and also of the Puritans, and having a positive view of the Puritans in that way. Um, my initial introduction started with that my first visit there on that Sunday. They give all the people who visit at that church, at least they used to, 25, 30, 20 years ago, a packet of books. And one of the books was this book, and this is the actual copy, I think, Today's Gospel, Authentic or Synthetic by Walter J. Chantry. And I read that book, I think, pretty much that week after I got it. And it revealed many things that made sense to me. It revealed a lot of the inadequacies I had seen in my own experience in my church background in Georgia, inadequacies in evangelistic methods and tactics, gimmicks in our day. At the same time, it revealed the true message of the gospel and also walked through the rich young ruler, Jesus' encounter with rich young ruler, and how do we rightly evangelize. And so it was really powerful in my own life, really opened my eyes to see the gospel in a very clear way. Even though I was a Christian, I didn't have that clear understanding really until coming to that church. This book played a big part in that. And one of the things I noticed about the book was on the back, it had that little George Whitefield figure, and it said it was the banner of truth trust. I didn't know much about it, but that was kind of my first introduction to these things. But then I was introduced, after kind of being introduced to the banner of truth trust through that book, I was introduced to the Puritans. And that came in that church in this way. When I was converted at 15, I had a desire to serve the Lord. I even had desires potentially of being in pastoral ministry, but I didn't really know what that meant. At the church that I was at in Georgia, I remember going to my pastors and asking them, how do I discern if I'm called to the ministry or not? And they really didn't have any good answers for me. They didn't really help me. But when I came to this church in Greenville, South Carolina, I remember as I was there, getting to know the pastors, and I was talking to one of the pastors about this question, and he said, well, I'd like to invite you to come to a group that I have, a group which he called Spurgeon's Club, in which it was a group exactly for young men who were wrestling with whether or not God was calling them to the ministry. And he had developed a 2-year kind of curriculum where he would give us articles and books to read, cassette tapes, because this is before the digital age, of sermons and lectures to listen to, and we would talk about a different topic each month on a Saturday morning. And it was actually in the third meeting, so I started attending it right away, my freshman year of college, and it was in that third meeting that we started talking about a call to the ministry. And he had given us some articles to read, and they were photocopied out of this magazine called the Banner of Truth magazine. And so I actually still have the article here, photocopied in these pages. And it was an article called this, Serious Self-Examination Before Ordination by Matthew Henry. And again, we're talking about a call to the ministry. And even just the introduction, if you allow me to read the introduction from the editor about this little article, he said this: one of the greatest legacies bequeathed to us by the Puritans was the high view they had of ministerial ordination and the sacredness of preaching. Soundness in the faith, they insisted, must be matched by holy dedication on the minister's part. Scarcely any aspect of the Puritan outlook is more relevant to us today. It is a large part of the weakness of the modern pulpit that heart-searching self-examination of the kind here exemplified by Matthew Henry, the eminent Bible commentator, is uncommon and even undreamed of. If preachers wish to be unashamed in the great day, they would do well to learn this art of self-scrutiny. So he's talking about this Puritan, Matthew Henry, and I'm reading this and reading the article itself, which is really a series of questions to ask yourself. It begins by quoting from Psalm 139, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." And then it goes on to questions in different areas. The first area is, what am I? And ask questions like this: have I ever been inwardly convinced of the lost and undone condition in which I was born, that I was by nature a child of wrath, even as others? Goes on, have I real love to holiness? Do I press after it and earnestly desire to be more holy? And the whole article, and all these pages, it continues in that way. Certainly very heart searching, as you can understand. And that was very impactful to me to see how these Puritan writers were such surgeons of the soul. Um, and and so I really appreciated those things. And then 2 months later, in the same group, the Spurgeon's Club, that's when I was actually introduced to Martyn Lloyd-Jones. How? Well, not him in the person, of course, in the flesh, because at that point he was in heaven, and he didn't come down or anything like that. But one of the books that we had to read for that group was this little Banner of Truth book called Authority, um, which is a series of three lectures that Lloyd-Jones gave in 1957 to college students. And they deal with the authority of Jesus Christ, how to understand the authority of the scriptures, and the authority of the Holy Spirit. Again, that was very powerful to read these messages of Lloyd-Jones. And at the same time, what was encouraging, that was the same month in which we were given cassette tapes to listen to the lectures that Lloyd-Jones gave in 1969 at Westminster Theological Seminary, Preachers and Preaching. So I didn't read the book first. I actually got to listen to the recordings of the lectures and hear Lloyd-Jones' voice in that sense. So whenever I read his books, I kind of hear his voice, in my head in that way. But that also was a real help to understand the wisdom the Lord had given him about preaching and how preaching is the greatest need of the church. And so that's how I was introduced. And just to kind of give you my own testimony from there, I continued to grow and to learn from the influence of Martyn Lloyd-Jones, from his other works, but also from the Puritans. And in no small part of that was Banner of Truth books. I even remember after my freshman year, I was doing a summer mission project with a group up in Indiana, um, near in Purdue University. And sometimes I would go to secondhand bookshops, and I remember being so excited that I found a Banner of Truth book in a used bookstore. I still have it. Christian in Complete Armor, the whole thing in one volume, and I got it for $1. You can't beat that. So starting on my journey of seeing and learning from Lloyd-Jones and Puritan writers. And so now let's turn more directly to actually Martyn Lloyd-Jones and the study of the Puritans. And I want to do that kind of in three main sections. We'll start by considering the influence of the Puritans on Lloyd-Jones himself. Then secondly, I want us to think a little bit about the influence of Lloyd-Jones on the study of the Puritans today and in his day. And then briefly at the end to consider Lloyd-Jones' views of the importance of studying the Puritans and some of the things of what does it even mean to be a Puritan in the way that Lloyd-Jones understood that. So let's begin by thinking about the influence of the Puritans on Lloyd-Jones. And uh, it's true that in one sense, Lloyd-Jones had at least a little bit of contact with the Puritans in his upbringing. Now, you may remember or know that he grew up in Wales, kind of in the Calvinist Methodist tradition. And so he loved to learn about their history. He himself wasn't necessarily a believer at that time. And even in his churches, while there was, in a sense, a certain proper form, it didn't perhaps have the same fire as it did in the past. It was one of the concerns that Lloyd-Jones had with the churches in Wales. But because he had this love for history, especially even as a young man, and he appreciated his church, he was interested in studying the history of the evangelical movement in Wales. and especially what happened with the evangelical revivals in Wales. And so he had heard about men like Daniel Rowland, who lived in 1711 to 1790, was greatly used of God in those evangelical revivals that occurred during that period. And Lloyd-Jones himself said this. He said, "I observed that the leaders of that movement, the revival movement in Wales, Daniel Rowland and others, were obviously diligent readers of people called Puritans. They would quote from them, and indeed at times were charged with having preached some of their sermons." um, and that had aroused my general interest, he said. So, at least in his growing up, from those things, he had some general interest in the Puritans. But again, an unconverted man, not really deeply interested in them, but he had some knowledge. It was actually when he was about 26 years old in the year 1925 that the interest really began to deepen. And when Lloyd-Jones was in London, it was his practice um, as a doctor and assistant to remember to Horder that he would attend Westminster Chapel for at least one of the services on Sunday. And in 1925, the minister at that time was a man named Dr. John Hutton. And Lloyd-Jones appreciated his ministry. Well, in that summer of 1925, he went to the U.S., I think, for the summer. Hutton did, that is. And then he was due to be back in September of 1925. So Lloyd-Jones had missed him being there to preach, and so he was looking forward to his return in September. But to his chagrin, we could say, sadly, Hutton did not actually return because in August of that year, the editor of a magazine called the British Weekly died, and John Hutton agreed to take the editorial work up. And so he no longer, he left being the minister there at Westminster Chapel and took up being the editor of the British Weekly. Now, Lloyd-Jones, because of his appreciation for Hutton, actually started to become a reader of that magazine. Now, the magazine itself didn't have a lot about Puritans. There were occasional references at times to the English Puritans, but what happened is in the actual issue where it's announcing John Hutton's the new editor and those kinds of things, there was an advertisement for a new edition of the autobiography of Richard Baxter. And so from that, Lloyd-Jones was interested and he picked it up and read it. He read this other book, The Life of Richard Baxter, by F.J. Powicki, if that's how you say his name. And that had a great impact on Lloyd-Jones. One of the statements that Powicki says in his book is this: the Puritans were men sure of God, sure of God's will, sure of the absolute duty to act in his sign and for his approval, his design and his approval. Nothing else mattered by comparison. Consequences were of no account. Obedience alone held the secret of freedom, courage, peace, power, happiness, and salvation. Essentially, they were right. And it was reading about the life of Baxter, the statements like that from the author, that captivated Lloyd-Jones. Ian Murray, in his biography of Jones, this way: such was Lloyd-Jones' first introduction to the Puritans, and his affinity with them was instant. He just loved what they were saying and how they were saying it, the substance of it. In fact, you could say so great was this new interest that he had in the Puritans that not too long after this, he was asked in the final session of the Literary and Debating Society at Charing Cross there in London, at their last meeting, which occurred in March of 1926, he was asked to speak, and he decided that he would speak on Puritanism. Um, and in his speech, he explained that Puritanism, as he found it in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, because he also started to pick that up. He had Richard Baxter. He also read some of George Fox. He said that in it was nothing other than thoroughgoing Christianity, and that what was needed to interpret Puritanism was not a vast erudition, but an experimental knowledge. That is, an experiential knowledge of the reality that they're speaking of, the reality of God, His holiness, and the power of the gospel. Listen to some of what he said in this speech. Again, he's like 26 years old or so, 26, 27. And this is what he writes or said: if you wish to know what Puritanism really is, Don't read large volumes on the subject by men who may be scholars but never were Puritans, but rather read the life stories of the Puritans, such as I have named, and pray God to give you light not merely to see what is in print, but also to see what is between the lines. The great truth of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is not that Christian endured great hardships on his way to the eternal city, but that Christian thought it to be worth his while to endure those hardships. He goes on to say, the only people who have a right to say anything about Christianity are those who have felt its force in their own lives. I do claim, therefore, with modesty and humility, that I have known something, I believe, of this. The spirit which animated the old Puritans, the spirit which all Puritans have felt at some time or other, I cannot, that's what he said, but then he goes on, I cannot claim, unfortunately, to be a real Puritan. Here you have his humility, because an analysis of my life finds me seriously wanting. But there have been moments, unhappily infrequent, when I have felt that I could move mountains. It is with the memory of these moments that I hope to be able to tell you something of what Puritanism means. So that's how he introduced this speech on Puritanism and why it was so important. He goes on, though, to say this as he speaks about the Puritans. He says, I've mentioned Baxter, I've mentioned Bunyan and Fox, but if you wish to have the best description of all of what Puritanism is and what it means, he said, read the epistles of St. Paul. So again, he's saying it's basically just as Christianity as understood and revealed in the scriptures. He then gives this maybe somewhat interesting analogy for those in his own day who only think of the Puritans in that kind of negative kind of light. He said this, during the air raids, and here he's talking about the air raids of World War I, not World War II, because it's obviously 1926. During the air raids, many of us, indeed most of us, objected to the restrictions that were imposed upon us by the army commanders. We objected to dark blinds and shaded lights. We objected because we did not realize the danger. We did not realize that we were at the mercy of those powers that were in the air or might be there at any moment. But the army commanders knew and carried out the preparations on our behalf. He goes on to say, sin is ignorance, and we object to the restrictions and the vigor of the Puritan regime. But let me remind you that the Puritans are and were the commanders in chief of God's garrison here upon earth. And then he talks about how the Puritans saw God as both the one who was the hound of heaven pursuing them, at the same time, the one who brought them unspeakable joy and knowing the love of God. So he says it this way, God does not always appear to the Puritans as the hound of heaven. There's another mood. There are occasions when God is love, when God is a gentle father taking on occasional walks in his garden, that is, on the earth on which we dwell. During these days, nothing can equal the ecstasy of the Puritan. Richard Baxter felt the gale of the Spirit and bowed his head to it, lest the sensation passed. The immanence of God may be a mystical idea, but it is certainly no myth to the Puritan. So he's talking about the real experiential aspect of Christianity, of communion with God, and how God has transforms his people, transforms them so that they hate sin and they fight a war against the world, the flesh, and the devil. And they also know the joy, the greatest joy of communing with the Lord. And so that's after just really reading from in the fall. And then in March of the next year, he gives this speech about Puritanism. Well, it's clear that it was not a passing fad in his life, but this became an intense study through the rest of his life. And so you can think about the ongoing interest and impact on his ministry, which becomes clear when he settles in his first pastorate there in Aberavon in South Wales, where he has given up the work of being a medical doctor, as we know, and taken up the work of being a spiritual doctor. And the impact of the Puritans on his preaching is clear from the very beginning. One of the very first sermons was on Hebrews 13, verse 14, where it says, for here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. And in the very introduction of the sermon, he again is speaking about Puritans and Puritanism. Listen to his introduction. He says this about the Christianity today. Our Christianity has the appearance of being an adjunct or an appendix to the rest of our lives, instead of being the main theme and the moving force of our existence. We seem to have a real horror of being different. Hence, all our attempts and endeavors to popularize the church and make it appeal to people. We seem to be trying to tell people that their joining a church will not make them so very different after all. Oh, we're no longer Puritans, we say. We believe that they overdid things and they made Christianity too difficult for people. They frightened people with their strictness and their unnecessarily high standards. We are not so foolish as they are as to do that, we say, and indeed we do not do so. We have lost that idea and view of life, which was so forcefully stressed and emphasized by the Puritans and the founders of the churches to which we belong. The idea that life is a pilgrimage, and that while here on earth we are nothing more than travelers. The fathers wrote about life in that way, talked and preached about it like that, and sang of it in their hymns in that way. They were but pilgrims in this barren land. Now this idea has almost vanished out of our vocabulary, and it sounds strange to us. If you have faith in Christ, though, you will not resent the fact that life is a pilgrimage, but will rather rejoice that it is so, because you will know that the pilgrimage is but a part of your exodus, an exodus from Egypt into Canaan, from bondage into freedom, and that an everlasting freedom. Your only regret will be that it takes such a long time. But even while you are here, you will know a peace of mind and a comfort that no one else can possibly feel. So again, there in his preaching at Aberaven, he's beginning in different evangelistic sermons. This one on Hebrews, he's showing the loss of what the Puritans had emphasized, and in the church of his day in Wales, was more concerned about making people feel comfortable, and to say you don't need to really exert any effort in your Christianity, and you don't need to worry about holiness and those kinds of things. And he marks against that clearly in the sermon. Now, the influence of the Puritans obviously continued through his consistent study and reading throughout his life. Ian Murray, in his biography, describes Lloyd-Jones' reading habits as he began the ministry. What did it look like for him? And of course, he begins by saying that the chief place for Lloyd-Jones was reading the Bible itself, not to find text and not for sermon preparation, but first and foremost for his own spiritual growth, his own soul. He says that one of the things Lloyd-Jones did is he aimed to read through the entire Bible at least once a year, omitting nothing. Lloyd-Jones himself said that should be the very minimum of the preacher's Bible reading. And Lloyd-Jones was able to then study the scriptures, understand them well, quote them from memory. But second place then to the Bible, though, was his reading of the Puritans and of theology from the Puritans. Again, Murray says his discovery of Richard Baxter in 1925 had been followed by other 17th century acquisitions purchased in secondhand bookshops in London. And not only that, what did he get as wedding presents? What every true preacher and theologian really wants. He got the works of John Owen from friends who were able to find them in different secondhand shops, because it wasn't something that was readily available in that time and in that day. But he was able to be given that, and also to be given things like Baxter's Christian Directory. Over time, he actually began to prefer John Owen more than Baxter, but he always appreciated Baxter's Christian Directory. So this reading and study of the Puritans would continue to deepen as he continued in his ministry and his life. And two things were to help with that even more. And two things were the Evangelical Library, and we could say the Puritan Conference. And that moves us then into our second point. Instead of thinking about the influence of the Puritans on the life and ministry of Lloyd-Jones, let's think a little bit now about the influence of Lloyd-Jones on the study of the Puritans. And perhaps one of the great things that, as Lloyd-Jones would later say, was the mother of further spread of Puritan teaching is what's called the Evangelical Library. Now, what is that? Well, it can be traced back to a man named Jeffrey Williams. And Jeffrey Williams was someone who was converted in 1903 at the age of 17. He was converted in a strict Baptist church called the Gospel Standard kind of denomination of churches in that time. Kind of those that came in a similar way from Spurgeon before the downgrade controversy, um, and those who came, from kind of the 1689 crowd in one sense. So he was converted in that, and the pastor that was in that church directed this brother, Jeffrey Williams, to the works of the Puritans. And he loved reading these books, especially seeing the sovereign grace of God and how it edified his own soul. So he decided that he wanted to begin collecting as many of the Puritan works as he could find. So he started buying books in all these secondhand shops whenever he could find them of the writings of the Puritans. So this continued, and by the 1920s, he began to loan out some of these books to some of his friends and had the desire and idea then maybe this could be a helpful ministry to have books that people could come and check out and bring back. And by 1928, this is, a good 25 years after his conversion, he had actually amassed 20,000 volumes of Puritan works. So he had all these volumes, and he was really wanting people to come and to read and to share in them. Well, that was very slow going from 1928 to 1938, the next 10 years or so. There were very few people that were actually coming that were interested. And in one sense, he was growing a little bit discouraged. Well, then one day he was talking to a pharmacist in London, needing some medicines, that kind of things, a chemist. And this pharmacist was a Christian. And so they struck up a friendship. And as the pharmacist also begins maybe to know about these books and Jeffrey Williams' desire that more people would actually begin to read them and check them out, this pharmacist had begun attending Westminster Chapel and said, "You really need to speak to Martyn Lloyd-Jones, the doctor. You need to speak to him about this idea. Let me connect you to it," basically. Um, and so he did connect him, and Martyn Lloyd-Jones went down to visit the library of Jeffrey Williams, which was kind of south of London. So it wasn't in London. It was a little bit out of the way. And Lloyd-Jones, in writing a letter to someone after visiting the library, mentioned how he was so impressed and greatly appreciated this collection of treasure of the Puritan works. But the one thing he really didn't like about it was the location, because it was south of Wales, not easy to access. And in one sense, it's no wonder a lot of people aren't checking out books. So an idea was born that perhaps this library could be moved and moved to a more accessible place, moved, in fact, to central London, moved right near Westminster Chapel, if not in it. And so this would not be an easy thing, because by this time, this is now 1938 or so, 39, the library had grown to 25,000 volumes. So the expense and the cost, so some monies needed to be raised in order for this to happen. But in the kindness of God, it did happen, and Westminster Chapel kind of had it nearby, and the board of the what became the Evangelical Library was formed in 1943 as an organization, and then it was about a year and some later, the January of 1945, that it was finally opened up to the public. And there, being in central part of London, Jeffrey Williams' desire was fulfilled. More people started to get access to this library. And this is part of what led then to the spread of Puritanism and a study of the Puritans in Lloyd-Jones' day. So much so that 10 years after the opening to the public, so from 1945, now 10 years later in 1955, at the meeting of the board, the annual meeting of the board of the Evangelical Library, Lloyd-Jones said this in his address to the board: "There's another remarkable thing to which I must refer. I feel that we are witnessing a true revival of interest in the Puritans, and a number of young men are studying their literature constantly. There is held annually now, he says 1955, a Puritan conference, which is attended by some 60 people. And this library has played a very central part in it. All the men involved come here or to the branches of it in the course of their quest. As I see things, it is of supreme importance for the future of the Christian faith in this country that we should experience a revival of interest in the literature of the great Puritans of the 17th century. And to this end, the library is absolutely central and invaluable. And so it was this library that the Lord began to use even more. And again, in conjunction with Lloyd-Jones' preaching. Um, and in the statement that he gave to the board of the library, he mentioned not only the fact of the evangelical library contributing to this revival of interest in the Puritans, but he also mentioned the Puritan Conference. So that's the other thing I want us to think about here is the Puritan Conference. And this was born out of really Lloyd-Jones' evangelistic heart. What do I mean? As a pastor, he not only preached on his Friday lectures, which were kind of edification to the church, uh, but also Sunday mornings, edification church, Sunday evenings, evangelistic sermons. He also would preach often in other places, and not only in churches, but he also would preach a lot in universities, and was involved with different Christian organizations in the universities. He became involved with the InterVarsity Fellowship, um, among other things. At first, he really didn't think it was a great idea to do this, but his mind was changed, I think, when he went to one of these in the late 1930s in Wales. And that really began to kind of change his mind of how the Lord can use his these opportunities to preach to university students. And his preaching was greatly blessed of God when he went to these places. Students started to come to faith. They desired to continue growing. Um, and there was a particular group that really were impacted. And this was a group that was at Oxford University. His Lloyd-Jones' daughter, Elizabeth, actually spent time as a student in this university and was involved in the InterVarsity Fellowship, um, which is called something else, I think it's specifically there. But and Ian Murray says this about Lloyd-Jones' impact there. He said, undergraduates at Oxford were among the first of a younger generation of men in England who were to understand the theological reasons why Martyn Lloyd-Jones' preaching was not in the mainstream of contemporary evangelicalism. So they're hearing Lloyd-Jones preach at these conferences, and then they're at their churches where they are and hearing kind of the contemporary preaching, which didn't have the same power, didn't have the same heart searching application to it. And so they recognize the difference. Now, at Oxford, there was a student at Queen's College named Raymond Johnson, and he was enthusiastic about the preaching that he heard from Lloyd-Jones, and he started to become enthusiastic about the Puritans. And he had another friend at Oxford, this young man who you may recognize his name, James I. Packer. So J.I. Packer was a student there as well. And he also heard the preaching of Lloyd-Jones and was impacted by it. He first heard Lloyd-Jones speak at a Theological Students Fellowship conference at St. Hugh's College in Oxford in December of 1946. And from that, these students there at Oxford began to have a desire to read the Puritans. And they got particularly Owen, who you remember was the chancellor there at Oxford. So they're reading John Owen and others. And Packer writes in 1947 about how he, Elizabeth Lloyd-Jones, and others belonged to a group who used to, he says, eat cheap food together in British restaurants and talked about revival and also about Calvin, Owen, the Welsh evangelical heritage, and the Puritans. So here's a group of college students going to, the local pub and eating and then talking about the Puritans. Well, in 1948, that was 1947, 1948, Packer and Johnson both moved to London, and Packer begins working at Oak Hill College. Johnson something else. But since they're in London now instead of in Oxford, they began attending Westminster Chapel. Now, both of them were actually only there for 1 year, but while they were there, they asked Lloyd-Jones if they could talk to him about something in his vestry. And so they met with him and they said, "What do you think about the idea of having a conference on the Puritans?" And they loved the idea. And he loved it. And so he said, "This is a good idea." And so they worked to put it together. The University Fellowship had a magazine called The Christian Graduate. And by June of 1950 is when they had um, an advertisement in it about the first conference, which was to be held in December 19 to 20 of 1950 there at Westminster Chapel. And so there's the first Puritan conference. And Lloyd-Jones was one of the speakers, not the only speaker. There were others, some of them students and others that spoke about the Puritans. And Lloyd-Jones in that first conference spoke about perhaps the most central subject to him about the Puritans, and that is Puritan preaching, which, just a plug, listen to Kirk Wellham in the next online fellowship about the preaching of Lloyd-Jones. And so they gave papers, but it wasn't just about lectures. The other thing that happened is they would give these lectures papers, which you can actually read many of the papers in a series of books by P&R called Puritan Papers. And also in that book that Drew is holding up, which has Lloyd-Jones's papers from 1959 to 1978. But the first 9 years wouldn't be in that book, but you can find them in the P&R books called Puritan Papers, edited by J.I. Packer and others. So they not only had the papers, but they also had discussions. So they would have a lecture given, but then they would have time of discussion and even debate. And Lloyd-Jones was the one to chair those discussions and lead them. And I think he greatly benefited from them, but also enjoyed them very much. Now, in that first conference, there maybe weren't many people. It was only 20 people. But as with the way the Lord works, there is revival that begins with small beginnings and it grows. And so, in what he said to the Evangelical Library in 1955, so 5 years later, it grew to about 60 people. And then as it continued, it was over 100 people. And so it grew over the years. And there was this then annual conference every December. Now, you may know, of course, there was a breakdown between Packer and Lloyd-Jones over issues of Anglo-Catholicism and other kinds of things going on, issues of ecumenicism, and Lloyd-Jones stand against those kinds of things where, not seeking unity just in externals, but Lloyd-Jones seeking a true unity in the true gospel. And so Packer and Lloyd-Jones parted ways, and so in the 1969, that was the last conference with Packer. They didn't I don't know if they had a conference in 1970, but then what happened is some approached Lloyd-Jones and asked if they could continue the conference, and maybe under a different name. And so they changed it from the Puritan Conference to the Westminster Conference, since it was still being held at Westminster Chapel. And they came again to start it in 1971. And so that was the conference. Again, Lloyd-Jones was used of God then for the spread of the study of the Puritans through both the Evangelical Library and then also through that conference. And at root, even before that, you could say through his preaching. But eventually, this growing influence leads to the formation of the Banner of Truth Trust. And so I want to say a little bit about that. As we mentioned, Puritan literature was not easily accessible in that day, mostly only in secondhand bookshops or perhaps going to university libraries if you could have access to that. But for most people, it was beyond their reach to get Puritan literature. And in 1956, Lloyd-Jones actually visited the United States and Canada and was preaching and meeting different people. And after one of the meetings, he said many young men came to speak with him. And as Lloyd-Jones recounts it, he says this: "Every single one talked to me about Puritan literature. and asked whether there was possibility of getting Puritan books from this country. It's true of increasing numbers of them. They, like us, are turning to the Puritans, and for the same reason. We're all tired of the typical periodicals and books and are not being helped by the literature of today. They felt that they wanted something solid for their souls. So, in the wonderful providence of the Lord, God made it so that the Banner of Truth Trust could be formed, and it worked in this way. The human means, there was a man named Jack Cullum who was in London, a wealthy man, and made his business in auditory kinds of things. And he had become a Christian and wanted to do things to serve Christ and the kingdom of Christ. Um, Around this same time, 1956, is when Ian Murray became the assistant to Martyn Lloyd-Jones there at Westminster Chapel. And it was just the year earlier, 1955, that he had been involved in beginning to publish the Banner of Truth magazine. So that, so reprinting small parts of the Puritans along with some other editorial articles and things. But there came a point where Jack Cullum met with Ian Murray. Cullum began to attend Westminster Chapel. And in 1957, they also were talking with Lloyd-Jones about this need for good Puritan literature to be republished. And so it was 1957, March of 1957, that they formed what's called the Banner of Truth Trust, so they could publish works by the Puritans. Their concern was not for financial profit, so it wasn't formed as a business, but it was formed as a charitable trust for the republication of Puritan works. And the first books came out in 1958. The first volume may be a bit of surprise to us, as maybe that wasn't what you would think is the first thing that should be published, but it was actually a commentary on the Song of Solomon. So that was the first thing that was reprinted by George Burroughs. And that was followed by Thomas Watson's A Body of Divinity, his work on the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Then that was also followed by Select Sermons of George Whitefield, and then Select Works of Jonathan Edwards, and then Robert Haldane's commentary on this. So that was 1958. 2 years later, by 1960, at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Library, Martyn Lloyd-Jones would say this: "We rejoice in the fact that now we can get so many really good books, brand new and beautifully produced, with glossy, shiny covers." That's what he said. "You see, the daughters are so much more up to date and attractive in appearance than the older ones. But do not forget the mother," he said. "The best books were available here," speaking about the Evangelical Library, "and almost exclusively here until 2 or 3 years ago." So the Evangelical Library, the Puritan Conference, and then the Banner of Truth Trust really was the means that God used through Lloyd-Jones for the spread of Puritans, for the study of the Puritans. Well, in brief, let me turn then to the third thing, just to say a few things about Lloyd-Jones' views on the importance of studying the Puritans. I think you've already kind of heard some of it in what I've read. And I do want to kind of just read and highlight a few things from an address that he gave at one of those conferences. At this point, it would be the restarting of the conference now as the Westminster Conference in 1971. He gave an address called The Puritans, Their Origins and Successors, which you can find in the book, again, that our brother just held up, The Puritans, Their Origins and Successors, addresses delivered at the Puritan Westminster Conference. And this one, again, is actually the address was called Puritanism and Its Origins. It's in this book. And so it's from 1971. And just a few things that he says about Puritanism. One of the things that we find is, why is he interested in the Puritans? It's not for some kind of pedantic reason. It's not to be erudite and scholarly. That's not his point. He said this: "I'm interested in Puritanism because it seems to me to be one of the most useful things any preacher can do. Nothing so encourages a true ministry of the word, because these men were such great exemplars in that respect." So again, his focus is on preaching. And the reason that he studies the Puritans is because it equips men to preach the word faithfully and rightly with power from the Spirit. And so he talks about those aspects of things. Um, and he wants to go on and give kind of a clear definition of Puritanism and talks about how there's these different scholars who have some different views about it. But as he goes on, he wants to answer this question: when did Puritanism actually begin? Let me just read this paragraph from him. He talks about one professor, let's just say, who says it started in 1567 when the term Puritan first appeared. But Lloyd-Jones says he doesn't agree with that professor. He agrees with another, Knappen, in his book Tudor Puritanism. And he says it really first began to manifest itself in William Tyndale as far back as 1524. Why does one say that? For the reason that Puritanism, as I hope to demonstrate, is a type of mind. It is an attitude, it is a spirit, and it is clear that two of the great characteristics of Puritanism began to show themselves in Tyndale. He had a burning desire for the common people that they should be able to read the scriptures. But there were great obstacles in his way. And it is the way in which he met and overcame the obstacles that show that Tyndale was a Puritan. He issued a translation of the Bible without the endorsement and sanction of the bishops. That was the first shot fired by Puritanism. It was unthinkable that such a thing should be done without the consent and endorsement of the bishops, but Tyndale did so. Another action on his part, which was again most characteristic of the Puritans, was that he left his country without the royal assent. That again was a most unusual act and highly reprehensible in the eyes of the authorities. But in his anxiety to translate and print the scriptures, Tyndale left the country without the king's assent and went to Germany. And there, helped by Luther and others, he completed his great work. Those two actions were typical of what continued to be the Puritan attitude towards authority. It means the putting of truth before questions of tradition and authority, and the insistence upon liberty to serve God in the way which you believe is the true way. So again, God's word is higher. God's authority is higher than man's authorities in that sense. So then he goes on and he traces it from Tyndale on down. But that's the spirit, he's saying, of Puritanism, that all the people should be able to have access to the word of God, and that the great authority is God himself. Well, he ends that lecture by wanting to show some of the differences between the Puritan and the Anglican. And just let me summarize a few of the things he says here, which again gets at why studying the Puritans is important and what he means by Puritanism. One of the differences he says between the Puritan and the Anglican, who's not concerned for further reform of the church, he says, I hope I have demonstrated that it is a concern about the nature of the church. It is a desire for full and complete reformation. It is something that started with objection to ceremonies and vestments, but developed into a full doctrine of the church. He goes on to say a second difference between the Puritan and the Anglican is the difference, if you like, between an international and a national outlook. I think this is fascinating. He says, I mean by that what I quoted earlier about the difference between Knox and Cox. John Knox had an international outlook, and all the Puritans had an international outlook. They had seen church life on the continent, and they said, we are all Christians. We all belong to the same great church. They had an international outlook. The others, the Anglicans, had a national outlook. And with Richard Cox, were concerned primarily about the face of the English church. He's speaking broadly here, but that's the difference. There was more of a concern for the whole church around the world and not just in the country of England. He equates that with being Puritan. Another way in which the same point can be put is this, he says, the Puritan always wants to go back to the New Testament only. The Anglican is also concerned with tradition and custom and continuity. Anglicanism has always put an emphasis on continuity. That is why today she is regarded by many as the bridge church. She has always claimed to be Catholic as well as Reformed. Continuity and tradition. third thing or fourth thing he says is another way of putting it is that the Puritan bases all on the teaching of Scripture only, whereas the Anglican brings in reason. That particular emphasis began to come in with John Jewell, but it became still more evident in the teaching of Richard Hooker. The place Hooker gives to reason has been a controlling factor in the Anglican outlook. Then he says, yet another way of putting the difference is to say that the Puritan says that the evangelical view is the only view, whereas the others say that evangelicalism is just one view, one emphasis, one attitude, and that we should be content with being a wing of a comprehensive church as long as we are given liberty to proclaim our emphasis. This is a fundamental point. The Puritans would not have that, but the Anglicans have always contended for that. Then he says this, when you come to practice, I can summarize the difference like this. The Puritan emphasizes the spirituality of worship. The Anglican emphasizes the formal aspect of worship and is more interested in the mechanics of worship. The Puritan is interested in fellowship. The Anglican is more individualistic. The gathered church is at the heart of the Puritan idea, the fellowship. The Anglican is more individualistic. Puritans believed also in the ferreting out of sin and in a rigid church discipline, and the Anglican tends to be content with the outward conformity. So he wants a true spiritual church, spiritual vitality, um, directed by God through his word and animated by God, the Holy Spirit. This is what Puritanism is to Lloyd-Jones. And this is why it's so important to Lloyd-Jones that we study Puritanism, not for just scholarly sake, not for erudition, but no, to truly recapture in that sense how God has worked in his church in these different periods. Again, the Puritans not being the only period, but a high water mark in many respects, and to glean from them, to learn from them. In other words, Lloyd-Jones was saying that we should do the very work that the Christian Heritage Center is seeking to do, that we should look at those of the past to honor them, but not so much to honor them, but to honor the Lord and the work that the Lord did in and through them, and to recapture that even for our own day.